Aw, Izizelimnyama, Dlamini. Mr. Mbeki, thank you very much for joining me this morning. I really appreciate it, Tata. How are you doing?
I'm great, keeping warm in the cold weather of the high veld.
Mr. Mbeki, I'd like to start off with Black economic empowerment, which is a very contentious subject at the moment. And I want to take you back, way back to 1985, when South Africa was facing global isolation. Through economic sanctions, you even saw companies disinvesting and pulling out from South Africa. Ford pulled out, General Motors pulled out, Barclays Bank pulled out, which left the business community isolated. That's when you saw Anglo-American chairman Gavin Relly thinking outside the box to go meet up the ANC in exile to seek a solution. Can you take us through those events and how did they give rise to Black economic empowerment?
I'm not sure that those events gave rise to Black economic empowerment. Okay. The most important, they gave rise to two very important events.
Yes.
The first event was that, as you point out, foreign multinationals pulled out of South Africa, but they didn't take their subsidiaries and take them out of the country. They sold them to South African companies. So that disinvestment campaign that was run very successfully in the 1980s, what it did is it actually made South African companies, it made the South African economy South African owned. Okay. And this is something that many people don't understand. Before the disinvestment campaign, most of the South African economy was foreign owned, was owned by foreigners.
Okay.
Barclays Bank, for example, which you mentioned, was a British bank. It was one of the main banks in South Africa, but it was a British-owned bank. Standard Bank was owned, I think, by Standard Chartered, which was another British bank. What the disinvestment campaign forced the multinationals to do, Coca-Cola, for example, yeah. Coca-Cola had to sell its bottling plants to South African breweries, which was a South African company. So what the disinvestment campaign did is the banks, of course, which are very, very important in any economy, became South African-owned banks.
Okay.
Barclays Bank was bought, their South African subsidiary was bought, I think, by Rand Merchant Bank and by the Rembrandt Group, but essentially by Rand Merchant Bank. And so what was a medium-sized company, which was the Rand Merchant Bank, suddenly became a huge commercial bank by inheriting the infrastructure of Barclays Bank.
Okay.
The same applied to South African breweries. South African breweries was in beer, and beer was not. It suddenly inherited a massive global subsidiary of a global brand, and it created a company called Amalgamated Beverage Industries, which owned Coca-Cola and a whole lot of other soft drinks.
Yes, yes.
So the disinvestment company, the disinvestment campaign made the South African economy, whereas before the disinvestment company, a large part of the South African economy was foreign owned. At the end of the disinvestment and the sanctions campaign, the South African economy was owned by South Africans. This is a very critical factor to understand about South Africa. Now, South African citizens owned the banks of South Africa. Now, develop an economy, you have to own the financial institutions. In South Africa, South African citizens own our banks. So we have the single most important prerequisite to developing an economy is owning the banks. So the citizens, many people ask me saying, oh, but the banks are owned by whites. Well, it doesn't matter the color of who owns the bank. As long as they are South African citizens, that is what is important to us, because now the South African government can tell the banks what to do. It couldn't tell them when they were owned by the British, but it can tell them now what to do because now they are owned by South African citizens. So these race things that you know, the residual black consciousness misses out on the very important understanding about South Africa, how South Africa works, how its history works, how its economy works. People get blinded by the race politics, which is a thing of the past, in my point of view. Now, coming back to the mission by Gavin Relly, the business, which had been in an uncomfortable marriage or relationship with the National Party apartheid government from 1948 onwards. The National Party government depended on the repression of black labor. That was the key driver of the economy under the National Party. It was to repress black labor.
Yes.
One of our famous economists, South African economists, Professor Francis Wilson at the University of Cape Town, he did a study of black wages in the gold mines between 1911 and 1970. And he found out that the black wages had not changed between those times. The white wages had increased many times, but the black wages had not changed, were the same between 1911 and 1970. Now, how was this done? It was done through repression. The mine workers were not allowed to join the unions, and when they tried to go on strike, they were killed by the police and the army. One of the famous strikes was actually in 1946 by the African miners. And it was led by a man called J.B. Marks, one of our famous heroes of the liberation struggle. They were crushed by the Smuts regime. Another one was led by Cyril Ramaphosa in 1987, and they were crushed again by the apartheid regime. So the apartheid regime was dependent on repression. That was its main policy. And we all know about the past systems and all those things. I don't think I need to go. But by the late 1970s, repression was not working.
Yes.
So business abandoned its marriage of convenience with the apartheid regime and looked for a new partner. And they chose the new partner called African National Congress. So in 1985, the chairman of Anglo-American, and remember, Anglo-American had swallowed many of the companies that disinvested of the foreign. For example, I think they bought Ford Motor Company and set up a company called Delta. They were big shareholders in Standard Bank. They were big shareholders in South African breweries, if I'm not mistaken.
So just to recap, how much percentage did Anglo-American own from the JSE at the time?
Yes, they were the biggest by market capitalization. company in the JSE because they swallowed these foreign subsidiaries. So they decided that the strategy of repression is no longer working for them. It's no longer suitable for them. So they want a new way of organizing the society. So they went in opposition, by the way, to the then Prime Minister or President of South Africa, which was P.W. Botha, who threatened to shoot down the private plane that Gavin Relly and his fellow businessmen used to go to Zambia to meet the ANC. But they went ahead anyway, despite the threat, and they had their meeting with the ANC, which was then led by President Oliver Tambo. So for your, one of the people who was there, I think was Paulo Jordan, and he lives in Cape Town. So if I were you, I would go try and get him on your podcast to come and explain to you in detail what exactly happened in that meeting. I was not in that meeting, so you can get from the horse's mouth, as they say, from Paulo Jordan.
I'm sure, Mr. Mbeki, on the business side, there was much concern because obviously the guiding document of the African National Congress was the Freedom Charter that contained the nationalization clause. So I'm sure the business side were like, we are negotiating with people that might confiscate our assets. Do you think that the big business played a role in swaying the African National Congress to abandon the nationalization clause?
Oh, well, that's why I was saying, go and find Paulo Jordan and ask him what exactly did they agree to in their meeting with Gavin Relly of Anglo American. I wasn't there, so I can't say, and I have never seen the minutes of that meeting, so I can't say what they agreed to or what they didn't agree to. But I think Gavin Relly was relatively happy with the outcome of the meeting, which was chaired by President Kaunda, by the way. So find out from Mr. Jordan what he thinks.
Yes.
What actually happened in that meeting.
I can imagine, Mr. Mbeki, that the first priority of the African National Congress in exile was to dismantle apartheid by all means necessary. But do you think there was a focus on the economy that, look, if we take government tomorrow, this is the economic framework we are going to follow? Or would you say it was done in a very ad hoc way, especially in the negotiations?
Well, as you say, the guiding program of the ANC was the Freedom Charter, which was adopted in 1955. If you look closer at the Freedom Charter is actually not an economic change agenda. The priority of the ANC was to get universal franchise, i.e. to get a vote for everybody and to get a new constitution, a new democratic constitution, and to get rid of racial discrimination. That was the primary objective of the struggle. In fact, it was that objective going way back to the 19th century. So that was the focus. Many people don't understand the Freedom Charter. Mandela, he was asked in 1956, is the Freedom Charter a socialist program because of its nationalization clause? And Mandela was very explicit that Freedom Charter, the nationalization clause, was not in order to create a socialist economy. He said it was to dismantle the monopolies that were white dominated, that were an obstacle to the emergence of what he called a non-European bourgeoisie. That was an article which he wrote. So the purpose of nationalization was to remove the monopolies that were standing in the way of the emergence of what he called a non-European, or what we would today call black capitalists. It was never intended to create a socialist economy. And it was never intended to create a state-owned economy. That was never ANC policy. It was never the policy of the Freedom Charter. The ANC policy wanted to create African, colored, and Indian capitalists. And they wanted to remove the obstacles to the emergence of African, colored, Indian capitalists. So that they had the same opportunity as the white population to become capitalists if they so wished.
Mr. Mbeki, around 1990, when you came back from exile, and I can imagine many comrades at that time had to reintegrate with society without any steady income, who was paying for that transition at that time? Because I even remember the Soviet Union had their own problems. So would you say that big business played a role in funding that transition, especially in 1990?
Well, you know, the ANC was funded when when it was in exile by many people. But amongst the main funders of the ANC were the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden. So the Scandinavian countries played a very important role in funding the ANC, both in exile and in after we came back before the agreements on before the first election in 1994. The World Council of Churches, for example, had a huge program called the Program to Combat Racism. Okay. Now, the World Council of Churches program to combat racism also contributed to the funding of the exiles, ANC and PAC and Black Conscious of the exile organizations. And there were many other funders, but I'm just saying the Scandinavian countries were very big financiers. I had a scholarship to do my research for my master's. I had a scholarship from the Swedish government.
Oh, wow.
Yes, so, you know, we had a lot of support from especially from the people in Scandinavia, as I said. And then, of course, we had support, especially for the military side of the ANC's operations, from the Soviet Union, from Cuba, from East Germany, China, etc.
Mr. Mbeki, let's look at the first Black Economic Empowerment Company that was created around 1990. I sometimes wonder, where did they get access to capital at that time to buy into these large organizations? Because at the time, I can remember, Black people didn't have that much collateral to access such capital. So, yeah, it would be great if you explained.
Well, a few weeks ago, I was visiting Professor Willy Esterhuizen in Stellenbosch.
Okay.
Professor Willy Esterhuizen was one of the people who was involved in the secret negotiations with the ANC and with Thabo Mbeki that led to eventually the end of apartheid, the dissolution of apartheid. Anyway, I was visiting him. He's quite old now. And when I got there, I found a man, another famous South African called Franklin Sonn.
Okay.
Now, Franklin Sonn is the man who was part of setting up of the first Black economic empowerment called New Africa Investment Limited. He was the first CEO of that company. Now, Franklin's son lives, I think he said he lives in George, but he has an apartment in Cape Town. So that's another person you should interview, because then he will give you the detail of how New Africa Investment was set up, where the money came from, who were the participants, who were the drivers behind the setting up of this first Black economic empowerment. But very briefly, the main driver behind the setting up of the first Black economic empowerment was actually none other than the National Party itself. And they used Sanlam, the big insurance company, to set up the first Black economic empowerment. But the brains behind that project was the National Party, and I suspect also the Broederbond.
Just like that now.
Yes, so they are the guys who came up with the idea of and they used the Industrial Development Corporation, which is known as IDC. Which was controlled, by the way, but of course, by the National Party government at that time in 1991, 92, when the first this company was set up. They used IDC to lend money to the Black shareholders of New Africa Investment Limited to buy shares in a Sanlam subsidiary called Metropolitan Life. So as it happened, Professor Willie Estes was also a director on the board of Metropolitan Life. So you have a lot of very interesting people down there in Cape Town who can tell you what happened during that whole negotiation process, because they were part of the whole process. And as I say, Franklin's son, by the way, he used to be principal of Peninsula Technikon. So he is a highly respected person. He's a so-called colored person. He's one of the respected colored leaders, and it's worthwhile talking to him. He became ambassador to the United States. In fact, Mandela appointed him as the first ambassador to democratic South Africa to the United States, to Washington.
Mr. Mbeki, I was listening to some of your previous talks where you encouraged business to play a much more active role in politics, even further going and saying that they should start a capitalist party. So how do you think this will solve some of the challenges that we face today?
I'm not sure I actually said they should form a capitalist party. Anyway, you see, if you look at our politics, at our political parties in South Africa, the political parties that we have are largely parties of the middle class. The African middle class, the ANC, at the heart of the ANC is a party of the African middle class. Or it used to be a multiracial party from the early 1950s, but since it adopted the policies of Black economic empowerment, once it came into government, it has become more and more of an African party rather than the multiracial party that it was during the struggle. Now that's a big topic all by itself. But anyway, but it's a party of the African middle class. The DA is really, which is our second largest party, is really the party of the English-speaking middle class. Now, it doesn't mean, when I say parties of the middle class, it doesn't mean they don't have voters and supporters from other social groups who accept the leadership of the middle. They have. The ANC has the support of the African workers. The DA has the support of, for example, of the colored workers in the metros in particular, and so on and so forth, of the Indian workers, of white workers. But they are essentially parties of the middle class. Now, parties of the middle class in South Africa, economically, they are consumption driven.
Okay.
They are not investment driven. So the ANC is an investment driven party. And if you look at its policies, its economic policies, they are driving consumption, which is why we have this huge public service, very highly paid, made up of ANC members and sympathizers and support and the African middle class in the national employment, in provincial employment, in municipal employments, in the metros. So these are paid for by taxes, which essentially are taxing the private sector. So they tax the private sector and pay these phenomenal salaries to this middle class. And of course, it's the same with the DA. They get the same salaries. So the middle class parties and all the other parties, Rise Mzansi and Build One South Africa, Action SA, MK, EFF. These are all middle class parties set up by the middle class to advance the interests of the middle class at the expense of the working class and of the capitalists and of the poor. These middle class parties are actually center-right parties in economic terms. If you analyze them close, what they're doing, they're center-right parties, and they are consumption-driven. Capital in South Africa, on the other hand, is investment-driven. It wants to invest so that it can make a profit. You have to invest to make a profit. Also, it is faced with competition, especially from China, from India, from Asia. So it has to invest in the economy in order to be able to compete against the Asians. Many of us in South Africa, because when we go on holiday, we tend to go to Europe. But if you go on holiday and go to other African countries, you will see that South African countries are major players in other African countries, but they have to compete with Asian countries, with European countries, with Middle East companies, and so on. They have to be investment driven and they have to be research driven. So capital in South Africa is actually left of center. So it's an ironic situation we have that is almost unique to South Africa, whereby the middle class are to the right and the capitalists are more to the left. The workers are also more to the left and the poor are more to the left. So in fact, you have a potential natural coalition between the poor and the capitalists and the workers, or sections of the workers, whereas to the right of our politics, these are dominated by the middle class and sections of the poor and of course of the working class who vote for them. So that's the political landscape of South Africa. So yeah, I wasn't saying it's a capitalist party. I'm saying we need a left of center party that is investment driven. The parties we have today are right of center parties, middle class parties that are consumption driven, which is why our economy is stagnating and has been stagnating for a very long time. In fact, the South African economy has been stagnating effectively since the mid-1980s.
Mr. Mbeki, I'd like to zoom in quickly to the government spending, right? If 16% of our gross domestic product is spent in paying government salaries, do you think that is normal for a developing country for 16% of its GDP going into the public wage bill? And how would you solve that?
Similar countries to South Africa, which are middle income, higher middle income countries like Chile in South America, Thailand in Asia, Indonesia in Asia, civil service salary is 6% of GDP.
Right.
So we have to cut off 10% of GDP that is going into public service salaries and take that into investment so that we build up our infrastructure and modernize our infrastructure. If today the investment as a percentage of GDP in South Africa, fixed investment is only 15% of GDP. If we took that 10% that we from the salaries, our economy would now be at 25% investment. Then we'll be creating jobs. Then we will be building up our infrastructure instead of running out of water and a country full of potholes and our railways collapsing due to lack of maintenance. Then we will have money to maintain the railways instead of the middle class and the public sector consuming the savings of the country.
Yes, you can clearly see the deindustrialization of our country. Even where my parents stay in the Eastern Cape in Utenek, you are seeing quite a whole lot of manufacturing plants that are closing down. Goodyear is closing down. Mercedes-Benz in East London is also on a pause. So how do you think we can re-industrialize South Africa, because we are losing our industrial edge?
Yes, there are many damages that the present the policies of the policies of apartheid caused a lot of damage, especially to our human capital.
Yeah.
Things like Bantu education created a huge problem for South Africa's human capital. But since 1994, there has been improvement in access to education, but not to the quality of education. So what we need to have is to take resources from consumption, as I was saying, and the big consumption, especially of the middle class and the public sector, to investment. The World Bank runs something called the Human Capital Index, which measures how well you use the human capital in your own country. Number one is Singapore. Number two is Hong Kong. Number three is Japan. Number four is South Korea. Number five is Canada. South Africa is number 132 down the list. So we are not investing in our human capital. And if you don't invest in your human capital, you don't have the labor force, the skilled labor force to be competitive. As I was saying, is that South African companies are all over Africa. If you go anywhere in Africa, you will find Pick n Pay, you will find ShopRite, you will find Standard Bank, you will find Upside, and so. But they have to compete against Asians, which means they need highly powered, highly skilled base at home, because they have to have skilled people to sell. MTN is, if I'm not mistaken, the largest telecommunications company in Africa. So we need to make huge investments in a productive education system. Our education system is not productive. So what South Africa needs is, we need a cultural revolution in South Africa to change our mindset from the race mentality that the middle class are obsessed with into developing the society, into developing the country, the economy, so that we are as good as any other country in the world in terms of our skills.
Mr. Mbeki, if you look back at history, especially after the Anglo-Boer War, don't you think that the Afrikaners got similar concessions, just like BEE from the British?
Well, no. You see, there is a myth that the Afrikaners got their wealth or became wealthy because of concessions from the state, from Africana economic empowerment, and so many people want to imitate that and mimic that. What made the Afrikaners wealthy is they conquered land and cattle from the Africans. That's what made them wealthy. It gave them an asset.
Okay.
It wasn't any charity from the British. The British never gave the Afrikaners anything. But the Afrikaners conquered the land of the Africans and then set up, they started by conquering in the Western Cape the land of the Khoi and the San people. When Van Riebeeck came here, when you have time, you should look at the diaries of Van Riebeeck. I think you'll find them in his castle there in Cape Town. One of the first entries in Van Riebeeck's diary when he arrived, he said today, and I'm almost quoting him verbatim, he said today the Hottentots came past with their sheep, go past the castle that I am building. If I was allowed by the Dutch East India Company to dispossess these people, I could easily have done it and dispossess them of their sheep. So did Van Riebeeck buy any land to build his castle on? No, he just took the land. And then eventually the Dutch East India Company, if you remember, there was something called the Council of 17 in Amsterdam that controlled the Dutch East India. Van Riebeeck himself, they allowed him to now take the land of the Khoi and the San people, and he never paid anything for it. And then Van Riebeeck said, these people don't want to work for me. The ones I'm taking their land and their sheep and whatever but they don't want to work for me. So I'm going to import slaves. So the Dutch East India companies, the Council of 17 said, okay, go ahead. So he went to Indonesia, which was then controlled by the Dutch, or parts of Java anyway, and imported slaves from there, from Sri Lanka, and then from Madagascar, and from West Africa, from Angola, and he imported slaves from there. That's what made the Afrikaners wealthy. It wasn't any gift from anyone. They conquered the land from the African people.
Just before I forget, how do you think we should strengthen our relationship with the Americans? Because it's clearly evident that the relationship is strained.
No. Well, there's a relationship between the ANC government and the United States.
Yes.
There's a relationship between the people of South Africa and the people of the United States. There is no strained relationship between the people of South Africa and the people of the United States. The American companies, for example, are here. According to the American Chamber of Commerce, there are more than 600 of them, and they are very happy to be in South Africa. They're doing good business. Many of them are employing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of South Africans. So those are the people-to-people relations. And I think we are happy to be drinking Coca-Cola and all those things. And we are selling our cars to the Americans, and the Americans are happy to be driving our C-Class Mercedes or 3 Series BMW made in East London, made in Roslyn, and so on. So in a people-to-people relationship, there's no problem between us and the United States. Now, between the ANC and the Republican and the government and the United States government, well, that's a different matter. That's not between. It's between the governments. It's not between the people. So we have to distinguish. There is no crisis between the people of the United States and the people of South Africa.
But I'm just thinking, what if the strained relationship between South Africa and America leads us to being removed from AGOA? Because obviously we get duty-free access to drop our products in the American market. I'm sure that will further deindustrialize us. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, no, I mean, we need to do everything we can to retain AGOA, and we have to lean on the South African government to do all it can to make sure that South Africa remains a member of AGOA, because there are many jobs in the country that depend on our exports to the United States, and duty-free exports at that. So which makes our products competitive in the United States market. So yes, as citizens, we have to lean on the government to do the right thing instead of fumbling and not preparing for meetings and not answering letters after 10 days. I don't know how many letters is this government of South Africa has received from the Americans and is not answering them. They're just putting them in the in tray. These guys are not serious, And this is a threat to the welfare of the people of South Africa.
What do you think of China giving duty-free access to their markets to African countries?
The Chinese are smart, They can see that our government and the Americans are fighting over whatever it is that they're fighting. So they're saying, we'll give you duty-free, but you must also give us duty-free. For example, today the Chinese control our chrome mining industry. And they are taking raw chrome from South Africa and going to beneficiate it in China and selling it in the world market. So they are actually now using our raw material to become, to dominate the world market in some of our, using some of our minerals. So these are so there's nothing China is going to give you for nothing. And why should they? I mean, they paid for the chrome mining company. There's a company called Samanco, which is probably the largest chrome mining company in the world. And the Chinese now control it.
They control it.
Yeah, and they bought it. And now they're beneficial. Smelters, chrome smelters are closing in South Africa, and ferrochrome smelters are opening in China. When you have a confused government like we have, then you have no electricity. And if you don't have electricity, then your natural resources go out of the country in a raw state, unbeneficiated. But you can't blame the Chinese for that.
Don't you think we should blame Eskom for this? Because if I'm hearing you correctly, if we do not have a stable power supply, we can kiss beneficiation goodbye.
Well, with the current mismanagement of the state-owned enterprises, of course you can kiss beneficiation goodbye.
Mr. Mbeki, thank you very much for this interview. I really enjoyed it, and I hope the next interview you'll come down to Cape Town and then we can have a discussion, a face-to-face discussion. But thank you very much, Jabulela Zizi Dlamini. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.